being a little late. We had some technical difficulties. I'm Lauren, a special project assistant for Canada Historic Places Days, and I am at the Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Village here in Lamont County, about 30 minutes outside of Edmonton, Alberta. So I hope everyone is having a great day, and if you were able to watch some of the other events going on today, you did. We also have events going on throughout July, so you can check out what we have going on our website. Historic Places Days is a month-long marketing and tourism campaign to raise awareness and exposure for historic places across Canada. It's a month to connect Canadians with our culturally diverse history. And from July 3rd to 31st, we have multiple contests going on, including our visit list and selfie contest, where you can win Via Rail vouchers or $1,000. Check out our contests to learn more on our website at historicplacesdays.ca. Before I introduce my new friend and tour guide, Kevin, I want to respectfully acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory, traditional lands of the Cree, Blackfoot, Nakota, Tuatina, Dene, and Métis people. I want to apologize beforehand if you can hear the highway or if the wind gets in the way of our event. Please let me know if it becomes a problem. As well, if you have any questions or comments, please use the comment section to interact with us. And again, I really want to apologize for the technical difficulty to you guys, as well as Kevin. Definitely thought I was live there for 6 minutes. So here we go, here's Kevin.
Hello, welcome to the Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Village. My name is Kevin Bear and I'm a senior interpreter here at the village. The Ukrainian Village is a government of Alberta operated museum, a living history museum, where we show the history and culture of Ukrainian people living in Alberta between the early 1890s and approximately 1930. This is the time when Ukrainian immigration was a mass movement arriving in Alberta, specifically in this part of Alberta to the east of it. So we're located just at the boundary of Elk Island National Park in the beautiful Aspen Parkland region, as you see all the Our museum features lots of different vernacular architecture buildings that were built by people without formal training, peasants, people who were arriving, new immigrants, new settlers. And so what I'm going to do today is take you to a couple of our buildings. One that is a recreation that we did based on archaeological evidence of oral history, and one which is an original building that has been moved to our museum and restored. So these buildings I'm going to show you are early buildings that settlers would have created in the first years of their time in Alberta. Standing right now where we are, you can see all over my shoulder here, a building called the Fiducie, or nationale. So this building is the first temporary shelter that Ukrainian immigrants built when they arrived in this part of Alberta. And it is a building that is not the type of house that they would have lived in old country. In fact, they were going down a step in comfort to live in this type of building. This type of building is a type of building that shepherds and woodcutters living in the hills in western Ukraine, by the way, part of the world where the settlers were coming to Alberta from, not the steppes of the Ukraine, the flat area, and they were not coming to the prairies. They were coming from the hills of the Carpathian Mountains in what was the Austro-Hungarian Empire back then. And they were coming to the forested part of Alberta, the Aspen Parkland belt. And there was primarily a wood-based culture. So tools were made of wood, houses were made of wood, everything was wood. So when they're coming to Alberta, they're picking land from the government agents. The government of Canada was offering free land, but they weren't choosing open land, they were choosing treed land. And the reason is so they can build structures like this. This is a wood, a log building. It's got one large Y-shaped post here holding up the main beam, and then the front face, the front gable here, is made of poplar logs that are standing, pounded into the ground, and it's plastered with clay, and then the roof is made of sod. So some people compare it to a sod hut, but it's not purely made of sod, it's just roofed with sod. And it is semi-underground. It's below the level of the grade of the ground around it. So to prevent it from flooding, people tried to build these on their land on a high slope, and always with the door facing south. prevailing winds in our area are from the northwest. We don't want the snow and the rain getting in to the doors on the south. Now that happens to work with the vernacular architecture of Western Ukraine. Doors are always on the south side anyway. So that fits in nicely. Now this particular style of border day, like I said, it has this post here, but that's not the only way you can make a border day. You can make a border day that is only got one roof on one side. You can make a border day that's octagonal, that's narrow at one end and wide at the other end. There are many different ways to do it. Most of the people that were building these when they first arrived in Alberta would not have lived in them. They would have been familiar with them because of the shepherds and woodcutters, as I was saying, up in the hills using them. And some very poor industrial laborers around the cities and the mines and the oil fields of what nowadays is Western Ukraine, back then was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They would have lived in these as temporary accommodation. The peasant house that people were leaving behind in the old country is very much more similar to the second building that you see. But as you can see, they had to take a step down, build something temporary, get a shelter together so that they could survive the first years on the land. And as I was saying, because they chose land that was heavily forested, you look at all the trees around us here, there was a problem that farming couldn't start right away because there was no open land to plow. So we have to clear the land. Now what does that mean, clear the land? Clear the land means not only cut the trees down, but either burn or pull up all the stumps in the land. Now we have a problem, that's an awful lot of work to do. You can see in the background here we have a pile of felled trees in the background there. That's representing our slash pile where people have been pulling up trees to create this first garden here. Now, to do all this, it takes a lot of manpower or a lot of energy, human capital. Problem is, in the early days, most of the men arriving, and most people were arriving in couples or families, most of the men would go off and work on railways or mines for up to 6 months of the year to earn enough money to buy farm machinery and seed and livestock that they needed. So that means the people that were actually chopping down these trees, pulling up these stumps, were largely women and children. So as you're driving east of Edmonton towards Saskatoon, most of the way on that journey you're going to see land that used to be forested and was cleared at least partially by women and children.
Very cool. And you had mentioned that most of the other buildings here were moved here, but this one, it was made here?
Yes, this is a recreation based on archaeological evidence and oral history. So we've compared lots of different stories of people who lived in a border day in their early years. We looked at archaeological digs where we could find the remains of border day that still existed. We looked at drawings. We looked at written descriptions of people who were traveling through this countryside or other parts of North America where people built buildings like this.
And how long did it take you guys to build this, do you know?
Well, we rebuild it on a regular basis to keep it looking new. So it's been built many times and it gets re-plastered and restored. The original border days were, of course, temporary shelters, so they didn't have to last more than a couple of years at a time, hopefully, some people not even 1 year. They could be built by the settlers in as little as a day, although that's not common. It would probably be more like a couple of weeks or a month, depending on how much priority you're putting on that versus starting your garden, planting your first field, that sort of thing. Now this particular border day, the way we have it restored to, it represents a family that came here with a little bit of startup money. And you can tell that because they have glass windows, which not everyone has. And they have a metal stovepipe at the top, which is a very important safety feature. It keeps the sparks off the sod roof of your house. And these structures, they were relatively safe, but they were not perfectly safe. They would cave in occasionally under heavy rains. Animals would get into them, snakes and mice. Bears would try to break the doors down. Bears would be climbing on the roof because it just looks like a hill, so they get up onto the top. So they were not perfect, and not everyone, frankly, made it through their first few years in Canada, but there were some people that didn't.
And before we move on, I'm going to give another look inside. So how many people would be living in here?
The family, the way that we've recreated it, the family is the wife, the husband, and their first youngest 2 children. But This is just a typical scenario that we created when we recreated the house. There was any number of people who could be living in the room, 1 to 10 or more.
Sounds good.
At the back here, where we've got our garden planted, you can see the most important thing after shelter to ensure your survival in the early years was food. Well, there's water too. You'd have to go down to the creek to get that. But here we've got planted garlic, poppies, beets, potatoes, the basic things that you need to survive. In the early years, people were foraging for berries, gathering mushrooms in the forest, hunting, trapping, and the garden. The garden was a key part of the diet. You weren't buying any commercially produced food, and you didn't even have much to sell because the field sizes were so small. You could only plow any areas that happened to be a natural meadow that weren't covered with forest. Speaking of which, behind me over here, we have one of our fields that our historic farm program at the village has planted with wheat. So we do have animals on site here. We have livestock with chickens, pigs, horses. So this is a wheat field that we've planted with our historic farm equipment. We use horse-drawn implements to do all our planting and harvesting. And wheat is the big important crop that was grown in this part of the world at the time. Wheat, barley, and oats would be the 3 that would be grown in rotation, but wheat was the one that made the most money, so it was the most important. Wheat, of course, is for making bread. You can make bread yourself with it if you grind it yourself, and there are hand grind mills called nationale in some of our buildings. But as well, wheat later, not at this very early stage, but later, by the 1910s and 20s, especially after the First World War, became the most important export crop. That's how people made money, and that's how they could get a little bit more prosperous and be able to afford bigger houses, bigger building techniques, bigger implements. And that's what we're going to see when we round the corner. So we've left a typical 1890s or early 1900s early pioneer house when people are just arriving, and as we round the corner we're heading into the 19-teens, late 19-teens, after the great wheat boom of the First World War. We're going to see much bigger houses. This one over my shoulder here, this is, if you only were going up a little step at a time, that house there consists of just one hallway. It has no chimney, only 2 small windows.
And I don't know if you guys can see from your screens, but it looks like it's also made of clay.
Yeah, it's a log building. It's saddle-notched logs stacked on top of each other, plastered with clay. This one is not whitewashed, which we'll see is not typical, because they didn't plan to live in it then. So the year that we restored it to, it wasn't white. Later they decided they were going to live in it longer than it. The clay is also aesthetic. It looks nice, keeps the heat off because it reflects, it's white. And that's the typical thing you think of if you have a traditional Ukrainian house, is that whitewashed. And that's a the next place we're going to is the Greco house. So this is a house that is an original that was picked up and moved into the museum. And it is also a log building that's plastered with clay. But this one is whitewashed and has the full traditional Ukrainian style roof. If you look at the granary that we're passing as we walk by, you can see that without buildings, it wasn't necessary to do all the plastering and whitewashing. So you have the exposed logs here so we can see what the construction was like. So they're saddle notched on the ends. The weight rests on the corners. The middles are not supposed to touch exactly. There's supposed to be a little gap in there so that the weight rests on the corners to hold the corners together. They're chinked with clay mixed with straw and sand. And then if it was a house, instead of stopping at this point, we would throw hundreds and hundreds of pounds of clay, and I say throw deliberately because you throw it, at the wall to stick it into the gaps until you had enough to smooth it down, and then you'd whitewash it. And that's the same as what we did here on this one. I was speaking about them being restored on a regular basis. So you can see we have 2 different colors of clay on the front of the granary here. One that's a little more cracked and this darker one that looks a little newer. I did that last year.
Oh, good job.
Not me by myself. We have a restoration crew. They were very generous enough to let me help them a little tiny bit. But we have trained professionals to do that sort of thing. They don't just let interpreters do whatever they want. But you can see how we have to do maintenance on these because these are natural materials. They don't last forever. These wood buildings, they were not meant to last forever, to be frank with you. Some of them have been in the museum longer than they were ever used in their original lives.
And I see that it's resting on rocks. Is that normal?
Yep, that is the normal way to do the foundation. Especially with the granary, you don't have a basement, you want it sitting up higher for airflow to keep it cool. And because your wagon is probably about this high, so you're taking sacks of grain or shoveling grain in and out of your wagon into the door.
Crazy. And where did you get this building from? Do you know where in Alberta?
Yeah, so our study area that we study in the museum is the area between Elk Island National Park and St. Paul, Alberta, in a roughly an oval shape, 150 kilometers long by 75 kilometers wide or so. And so all of our buildings are from farms and towns in that area. We restrict ourselves to that study area. So for the Greco house, for example, if you want to be specific, this house was right on Highway 28 just outside of Smoky Lake when we found it. So the house here is more like what people were leaving in the old country, more like a typical building that you would find in the province that they were from. This particular family is from the Austrian province of Bukovina. So in Bukovina, this is more or less what a typical house would look like, although having lived in Canada already for a few years, these guys were lucky enough that they were doing fairly well, and so this is maybe a little bit larger. One of the key things I want to show you about this house right now, because it happens to be the heat of summer, designed in such a way that the shade line at the height of the day, because we're near the height of the sun right now, is exactly covering the window. In December, it's exactly at the top of the window. So that is meant so that all the light gets in the winter and none of the light gets in the summer to keep it cool. So that's passive solar heating, the technology that they knew about at the time. And this is the south face. Traditionally, these buildings always face south in the old country, and this one also faces south on its property. We have it facing south here as well. So when we go inside, we probably want to also take a peek at the rafters here and see what the materials are like that it's made out of. The joinery and the little details here. They didn't have to put those nice little, you see it's held together with wooden pegs as well, but you also see the little decorative elements there. They didn't have to do that, that was just because they liked it. When we go inside, you're going to see it's a two-room house with a central hallway, and the use of space, I think, is the most interesting part about this. Because the Ukrainian traditional way of using space in these farmhouses is very particular. You'll see what I mean when I get inside.
And sorry, before we go too far in, we have a question about the material on the exterior of the white building.
Yep.
So I believe it's the clay that we had previously talked about, and then is it the wood underneath of it?
Yeah, exactly right. This building is a log building exactly like the other one we saw, just that it's been plastered to the point where you can't see the logs underneath, and then whitewashed with a lime water mixture. And then they add a little bit of laundry bluing. If anybody has ever blued their laundry, it's like to add a bright white color back to your laundry so it doesn't look gray. But you add some of that to the lime mixture and then you get this nice blue streak at the bottom. While we're down here pointing this out, I should also point out that the way that the roof overhangs, there's actually a distinct line in the grass you can see where the rain falls to keep it off of the clay, because the clay doesn't take well to being rained on. So that's the other reason why the roof has to hang over that particular amount.
Perfect. Thank you. And thank you for asking the question as well.
Thanks for those. Do some more.
Yeah. Please ask more.
So in the central hallway here in the Greco house, we can see we've got two buildings, one on each side. Now, for the benefit of people at home, we're going to let you film inside here, because we're keeping people out to keep people COVID safe, but since you're watching from home, I think it's all right. People at home won't get COVID for coming in here.
Oh,
We've got two rooms. The one that I'm taking you into right now is called the Mala Chata, which means the little house. So the house is divided into two rooms, the big house and the little house. So the little house is where we do cooking, eating, and sleeping. It's a multi-purpose room. It's not a bedroom, it's not a kitchen, it's not a dining room, it's all of those at the same time. So
the account that asked about the exterior material, their username is Lime Thistle Plastering, and they said they have lots of lime putty if you need any. Thank you for that.
So So that's the basics of this room. Is the small room is the multifunctional room. It does a little bit of everything. We've got this house. They never built a traditional clay plastered oven to go with their clay plastered house. They went straight to buying a cast iron stove from the catalog. But in this spot, you would often see in other houses a clay oven, and it would just have a small metal plate at the top as a cooking surface for a stove, but most of you would do a lot of baking, especially bread baking in there. The benches are the traditional way of seating. You don't see a lot of chairs. Usually they're benches with these special woven bench covers. And so those would be custom built by the family as they're constructing the house to match the space that they have created. And the same with the table. The table is a home-built, custom-built one that they build to match the space that they have in this room. The floor, I should point out while we're standing on it, is a clay plaster floor that's hardened with a slurry made of, are you wait for it? Manure. The
Nice.
manure is used as a hardening agent to keep it nice and firm. So you have to sweep the dust off at the end of the week and apply more manure to patch the holes and harden it back up. So like I said, small room is multifunctional. We'll go to the other room. If I get it open, that is. Oh, you did a good job installing this. Alright.
Oops, sorry.
So this one is called the Velika Chata, or the big room, the big house, and it is just set aside as the special occasion room. In fact, the family that we are showing here, we've interpreted the building to had their wedding reception in this room in the year that we're showing.
And someone asked if it smells in here
Sure
because
does.
of the dried flowers.
It does. It smells delicious. We've got thyme and parsley and mint, lots of straw flowers and marigolds. Some of it is for seed saving, some of it is for dye making, some of it is for just culinary purposes, some of it's for medicinal. And so that makes it very pleasant to be in this room. You've got also the larger table in here. When you're entertaining, you can have lots of guests in here. They weren't above using it for storage a little bit as well, but you did want to keep it nice, looking good for guests that you're entertaining. And you can tell it's the special room also because it has the religious icons on the east wall. So always the east wall they will be on, and that is an aid to prayer. So you're usually facing east towards the icons when you're praying your daily prayers. So you can tell that that's the special room. It also has the tapestry on the bar wall here that's called a Kalim. And it's usually found on the north wall because it adds an extra layer of insulation besides just being pretty to look at. And another thing I want to point out to you here is the steamer trunk. So when people were arriving from the old world, they were fitting more or less their entire worldly possessions into the trunk that size.
My hand for reference. And Julia is asking, how often would there be celebrations in this room would be used?
Well, that's a good question. So it depends if you are the biggest house in your neighborhood. So the social convention is whoever is the biggest house in your neighborhood is the one that hosts all the parties. And so these guys were doing fairly well off for their district at the time, so they did host a fair number of parties, but you also can hold smaller gatherings whenever you like. You want to have friends over for cards, you know, you want to sing together, right? They also, the time of the year when you would host gatherings is different in Ukrainian tradition than it might be in other parts, because there are a lot of fasts in the Ukrainian religious calendars when you wouldn't have parties. So for the 40 days before Easter, for the 40 days before Christmas, and for two shorter periods during the summer, there are no parties, right? So Christmas, by the way, happens 13 days later for Ukrainians on the Julian calendar. So the party season for Ukrainians is January, not December. So everything's a little bit different. The one part about the construction here that I definitely want you guys to see is this central beam, the swap. And that color scheme and the way that they've carved across into the beam to bless the house is distinctive to the region that they came from. Their particular area around the village of Fiducie in what is nowadays Western Ukraine, back then Austria-Hungary, That color scheme and that way of carving the cross was done in other houses in that village. So that's particular just to that area.
Wow, that's so interesting.
So we try with our oral histories and our research to get things as specific as possible. And we use those specific examples to illustrate broader themes, because not every Ukrainian house looks exactly like this one, but it gives you a taste of what it was like.
Mm-hmm. And is the portrait here
That's
of...
the man of the house, Harry, he used to call himself in English, but properly Prohori.
Okay, I won't try and say it.
And so he didn't have a suit quite that fancy. That's actually touched. It's all painted onto him.
Wow. Hi. Wow, cool.
So did we find any more questions online?
Anyone got any more questions about this specific house?
If not, there's one more thing I want to show you.
Okay. Perfect.
You can also see, by the way, that there are ceilings in the two rooms in the house, but in the hallway it's open. And this particular house, like I said, because it has a cast iron stove, they have a chimney. But many of them did not have any chimney. And the smoke would just go out of the room, up into the loft, and filter out through the thatch, which brings me to the next building that we're going to look at. Most Ukrainian houses that were built in East Central Alberta at the turn of the century were thatched. Now, that's not a thing that you see in the countryside anymore. And the reason is, in the late teens, there was a devastating drought that went through this area. And at the same time, wheat prices were very high. People were flush with money. So to solve this problem, people took the thatch down off of their roofs and gave it to their animals as emergency feed. Then they took their money and bought shingles and shingled their houses. So we only have one example of a thatched building at the Ukrainian village, not counting the pigsty. One proper example, and that is the barn is a thatched building with those spikes at the top to keep the birds from nesting in the thatch. So this roof line shape and the general look of it, the mass of it, even though this is a barn, this would actually be more typical of what a house would look like when you were driving through East Central Alberta in the 1910s. That thatched roof silhouette is what you would see a lot. Now, this one is a barn, and we have a granary over on our left-hand side, and those are both traditional Ukrainian architecture in a manner of speaking, because they use a lot of the same techniques and the same roof line and that sort of thing. But the peasants that were coming here, most of them would not have had their own granary and their own barn in the old world, because their farm was so small that their animals and all their grain could be stored in little rooms inside their house. So they would have a long house, combination house with a barn compartment, a granary compartment, and a house compartment. So yes, is this traditional Ukrainian architecture? Sort of, kind of. They're using traditional techniques, but they're building much bigger, much more elaborate, much more specialized buildings than they would have had in the old world.
Crazy. And how would the thatching do with our climate?
Ukraine's climate is not as cold as here. It's roughly comparable to the Niagara region of Ontario, because they can grow grapes and different stone fruits and things there. So it's not quite as harsh as Alberta, but they get snow. So these steep pitches are meant to deal with all the rain and snow that they get. They're very well insulated because of the thickness of the walls. They have a lot of thermal mass. They retain heat very well. They actually, a lot of people complained when they moved out of these and moved into Canadian style frame buildings that they didn't hold heat nearly as well, and they found them much cooler. People preferred these for the warmth, but they didn't have the same prestige. English Canadian culture was dominant in Alberta. People wanted to look respectable. You had to look Canadian, so you had to build a Canadian house. So eventually, in the 1920s, this type of building went away, and you go to more conventional Canadian style houses that look like something you would order from a catalog or kit house, that sort of thing. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. And no, so it's a wooden structure underneath that you can kind of see. I'll bring you guys a little bit closer. You can see underneath the wooden and structure. And how much maintenance would this require?
Well, we haven't had ours rethatched for several years now. They can last multiple years. It depends how good of a thatcher you are. If you were doing the thatching in the old world, you probably knew exactly what you were doing. If you had seen someone do it once or twice and were trying to do it by memory, then maybe not as well. But at least they knew which types of grasses to use. At the beginning, you might just use whatever natural grasses you found around. But people would grow rye as a crop just so they could have the rye straw for using as thatch, because the rye straw works better.
Oh, interesting. And then the body of the house is the same.
It's the same as log, and then you can see where the joints are. It sticks away from the rest of the wall where the corners are. There's the logs sticking out right there.
Yeah.
And you can see it's put together with pegs. There's not very many nails involved. And so, in general, as you can see, the family would have a suite of buildings like this, a barn, a granary, and some machineries. So it's definitely not the early structure that we saw there. It's a different lifestyle altogether. People are not living hand to mouth. They are much better off in terms of their material possessions. And although they are definitely still living a Ukrainian lifestyle, speaking Ukrainian, going to the Ukrainian church, observing the Ukrainian holidays, Canadian influences are starting to creep in. They're eating jello to go with their meal as a dessert. That sort of thing. They're celebrating Christmas pageants at the school with their children. So you can see those influences creeping in. The cast iron stove is starting to get replaced with clay oven and that sort of thing. You can see elements changing. We had time to walk through the whole museum. I'd show you 6 or 7 more examples, but that means everybody that's watching at home has to come and visit us sometime.
Yes, exactly. So if whenever you're in Alberta next, or if you're from Alberta and you want to come visit, definitely come check it out. We looked at only a few of the buildings here, and there's a lot more to see. As well, you can always look at their website. There's a lot of information there.
UkrainianVillage.ca.
And does anyone have any questions before we go for Kevin or myself about the Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Village?
And while you're waiting for questions, I think I'll take this time to say thank you to Lauren, and thank you for having us for Historic Places Days. We really appreciate it. I want to say Diakuyu, that's Ukrainian for thank you. And because we would like to invite all of you to come back. In Ukrainian we say, see you next time. We don't say goodbye, there's a word for that, but we usually say see you next time, and it sounds like this. Do pobачення. Do pobачення means see you next time. If you like it, we want to see you again.
Okay, yes. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day going and learning about local and national history for the month of July for Historic Places Days. If no one has any questions, I will sign off. Okay, so no more. I also want to thank Kevin for the wonderful tour. I learned a lot, and I'm excited to check out the rest of the Ukrainian village. You did an awesome job. I hope everyone comes to visit and comes to say hi once it's safe to do so. Okay.
Thank you.